Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. Talking the Cold War and the fair deal. So 1945 to 1952, so it's going to be the early beginnings of the Cold War. That eventually will last until 1991. So we are on to chapter 27.
No sooner did the Second World War end than a Cold War began. President Truman grew increasingly suspicious about the motives of the Soviets in extending communism not only through Eastern Europe, but he feared around the world. In an effort to contain the expansion of Soviet communism, Truman in 1947, in an effort to provide military and economic assistance to Greece and Turkey in order to help them fend off communist insurgencies, announced the Truman Doctrine, which essentially said the United States was determined to contain the spread of communism wherever it might emerge around the world. In that regard, in 1949, Secretary of State Marshall announced the Marshall Plan, whereby the United States committed billions of dollars to restore the economies of Western European nations that were threatened with communist insurgencies. Still another effort to demonstrate the containment philosophy occurred in Berlin, when the Soviet Union, frustrated by the fact that the divided city of Berlin was in eastern Germany, controlled by a communist government, shut off, blockaded West Berlin from all traffic, forcing the United States and Great Britain to begin an amazing airlift, shuttling in supplies and food and water and medical supplies to West Berlin to enable the whole city to survive for months in the showdown with the Soviet Union over Berlin. The result finally was that the Soviets dropped the blockade. They would end up building a wall between East and West Berlin, but nevertheless, Truman's determined opposition to the Berlin blockade demonstrated once again his commitment to containment. Containment became the centerpiece of America's Cold War strategy in the 1940s and thereafter for decades.
Alrighty, containment. Okay, so during World War II, as the Red Army swept westward toward Berlin, it would retake land from the Nazis and install puppet governments in their place. While this violated a signed agreement, the Russians did not see it as a violation, but rather as self-defense. So when Truman inherited the presidency, he was placed into a crumbling alliance with the Russians. A diplomatic mistake was made when Secretary of State George Kennan tried to use the atomic bomb to pressure the Russians to back off from their demands. So to prevent Russian expansion in Europe and Asia, Secretary of State Kennan argued that the U.S. policy must be one of containing the Russians where they already were. So it is all about containment, keeping them where they are, not allowing them to spread out any further. And a lot of what we get involved in as time goes on is, that's why, because we're trying to contain. All right, the Truman Doctrine. So this is what you should have done your work on this week, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. So this should sound familiar. So Truman would introduce a policy, now known as the Truman Doctrine, in which aid to nations currently under attack by Soviet forces, either in secret or in public, was freely given to combat their attempts. 1947, to combat the still ravished landscape of Europe and the Europeans' inability to feed themselves, George Marshall, who was new Secretary of State to Truman, introduced a plan to provide aid to any European nation that requested it. Although they originally were included, the Russian delegation was ordered to withdraw from the imperialist scheme. So that's the Truman Doctrine. And with Truman, the main aid is for Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan is going to give you larger scope. So it's going to draw the Western European nations closer together, but it would drive the United States and the Soviet Union further apart. 1948, France, England, and the United States united their zone of occupation in Germany. They then organized a new democratically elected government. The Russians, the only communist member of the Allies, resented this action and began to restrict road and rail access from West Berlin. A blockade was then put on the city, and for months the only way that its citizens received food, coal, or medicine was via a massive American airlift of goods. And this is called the Berlin Airlift. So basically the Soviets were checking things and blockading and trying to keep people from going into West Berlin, which is located in East Germany, which is Soviet occupied. And so this is what we did in response to. As the Marshall Plan drew the Western nations closer together, it also increased the wedge between them and the Soviets. To expedite relief and recovery efforts, France, England, and the United States consolidated their holdings in West Germany in 1948. On April 4th, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, or NATO, creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, North Atlantic Treaty creates the NATO. Which pledged that an attack against one member was an attack against all, and would respond to as such. In 1948, Palestine, which had been under Ottoman rule until the dissolution of that empire following World War I, making it a British protectorate, was partitioned between Arab and Jewish settlers, recreating the Jewish state of Israel. The United States was the first nation to recognize the new nation, and almost immediately afterward, the Arab states neighboring Israel attacked it. Eventually, a peace was declared and Israel joined the United Nations. Still a very contentious part of the Middle East. Israel is a lot of religious battling that goes on. Alright, you should have seen this cartoon before too. It's the same thing. So the Marshall Plan, which distributed aid throughout Europe, is represented in this 1949 cartoon as a modern tractor driven by a prospective farmer. In the foreground, a poor, overworked man is yoked to an old-fashioned Soviet plow, forced to go over the ground of the Marshall-Stalin Plan, which Stalin himself tries to persuade others that it's the same thing without mechanical problems. Oh, gotta love Stalin. Alright. Let's see. So this is, the division of, Germany and Austria. So you can see that red is all of your Soviet zones. The purple is going to be British. The kind of yellowy color is French. And then we are the green. So we have that section that we are helping to settle after the war. All right, Harry Truman had been added to the Democratic ticket in 1944 when FDR ran for the fourth term. He was a virtual unknown in the Senate when he was chosen to be the Democratic vice presidential candidate. When he came into the presidency, he replaced many of FDR's cabinet members while favoring many of the New Deal programs. So he kept some the same, changed some stuff. You know. By 1947, the military had shrunk from 12 million to 1.5 million. This placed many veterans in need of education, employment, and housing. Americans born during this time came to be known as the baby boomers, where a large number of children were born following the war. It is the largest period in our history with the number of births, and these are going to be, this is kind of a lot of what causes the tensions in the 60s and 70s, because these children that are born in the late 40s and 50s are going to be teenagers in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And these, 60s and 70s. And these kids are going to, there's going to be a lot of them. They're going to feel like they have more of a voice, and it's going to be an action for change, basically. Congress offset the financial impact of demobilization by providing unemployment insurance and money to attend colleges and trade schools. So that's going to be your GI Bill. All right. Post-war America quickly demobilized, turning its attention to the pursuit of abundance. So, just like after World War I, after World War II, it is definitely a time of abundance and a very good economy. Big difference is how people chose to spend their money. So in the 20s, they're spending it on entertainment and a good time and liquor and whatnot. In the 50s, they're buying homes, they're buying cars, they're making more long-term plans. Family vacations, stuff like that. All right. So during the war, prices had been frozen to prevent gouging. Now with the war over, the government released control of the economy and prices skyrocketed. When wages were not raised to compensate, several unions went on strike. For the most part, Truman's administration was successful in combating the strikes, but after the 1946 elections, Truman gave up the battle. Following the war, Congress established the Council of Economic Advisers, which was charged with advising the president on the economic health of the nation. In 1946, Republicans took control of Congress and passed the Taft-Hartley Labor Act. It banned closed shops but allowed for union shops where they were permitted by state law. Truman vetoed the bill, but his veto was overturned. So, that's very pro-union. Okay, following the end of World War II, civil rights activists were able to draw on the horrors of the state-sponsored discrimination of Germany, Japan, and Italy to make comparisons to American problems of race. 1948, Truman would ban racial discrimination in the hiring of federal employees. Then he integrated the armed forces. Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948. He is the first president to really make a move towards desegregation, equality, civil rights, etc. Since Reconstruction. So, pretty big deal there. While this is occurring, Jackie Robinson is making his own case for the integration of society by being the first African American to play Major League Baseball. So remember we talked about pop culture on Wednesday? Pop culture, baseball. By his performance, he's able to illustrate that segregation was based on racism, not African Americans' supposed inferiority. So he goes in, he's a fantastic baseball player, and shows people what's up. Alright, after 3 years in office, Truman found that being FDR's successor was difficult. He ran for his own term in 1948, which was incorrectly considered by most political analysts to be a lost cause. In the State of the Union speech, he outlined what was to become his Fair Deal program: securing the human rights of U.S. citizens, protecting human resources, and extending government programs for the unemployed and the retired. Alright, here's our friend Jackie Robinson. 1947, he plays for the Brooklyn Dodgers and becomes the first black player in Major League Baseball. Alright, Democrats nominate Truman for his own term in 1948. The Republicans nominate Thomas Dewey, who was governor of New York. In an act of defiance against Truman's support of civil rights, a third party, known as the Dixiecrats, due to its makeup of former Confederate states, split from the Democrats. On election day, Truman wins the presidency, but it is a massive surprise, and you can actually find pictures of Truman holding up the newspaper that says that Thomas Dewey won. So nobody thought he was going to win, and he did. This is the opening of the 1948 Democratic National Convention, which is marked by demonstrations against racial segregation, led by A. Philip Randolph. Remember, he's the leader of the Sleeping Car Porters Union. Alright, Alabama delegates stand to boo Truman's call for civil rights before they walked out of the 1948 Democratic National Convention. So here's your election in 1948. So the Dixiecrats put in their own candidate, Strom Thurmond, and you can see he actually won 39 electoral votes. It's a close race, but it's not ridiculously close. It's 2.2 million difference between Truman and Dewey. But like I said, there's actually, in Illinois, for instance, I think that's where the paper was from, like from Chicago, they had pre-printed it thinking Dewey was going to win. And it went to print. So, alright. In China, the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek have been fighting the communist forces of Mao Zedong since the 1920s. During World War II, both had halted the Civil War and fought the Japanese. Once peace was obtained, America supported the restoration of the nationalists, even though it was widely believed that they were too corrupt to stand on their own. Soon after, Civil War erupted again, and the nationalists were forced from Japan. The nationalists were forced from China to the island of Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. It would be 30 years before the communist government in China was recognized. In Vietnam, the United States would try to bolster their alliance by supporting the French, who had colonies. They're opposing the communist forces of Ho Chi Minh. About the same time, it is revealed that the Soviets had successfully detonated an atomic bomb of their own, leading Truman to fund the construction of a more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb. And the Soviets weren't bombing anything in particular. They were just throwing their bomb to say, look, we have a bomb. As far as Vietnam goes, this is where we start to get involved in Vietnam. It was a French colony. The combination of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia became French Indochina. They fought for independence, and with our policy of containment, Ho Chi Minh was a communist. And so when he wanted to fight for independence, that's when the Americans step in and are like, oh no, we can't have this. And that's where we end up in Vietnam. Let's see. After World War II, Japan loses its claim to the Korean Peninsula, which it had occupied since 1910. The Allies would try to establish a new government there, but the act was hindered by Soviet forces, which had advanced into Korea and defeated the Japanese forces in the northern part. Much like the Germany situation, the Allies would agree to divide the nation at the 38th parallel. On each side of the border, separate governments were created, resembling the supporting nations. On June 25, 1950, North Korean soldiers attacked South Korea. Truman sent in forces under the auspices of UN support. After almost 3 years, an armistice was signed that ended the fighting and reestablished the border at the 38th parallel. So the 3 years we spent in Korea in an undeclared war, we never declared it war on Korea, were basically wasted because nothing changed. North Korea was communist, South Korea was not. That is how it is still today. So, there you go. All right, American soldiers, Korean civilian refugees march into the Nakdong River region in the south. All right. The Korean War is going to exasperate the anti-communist fears in the American public. To prevent communist invasions of key government positions, Truman established procedures to keep them out of office. The communists who were or had been in office were tried. The most famous case was that of Alger Hiss, who was found guilty for lying about espionage against the United States. And this is going to kick off another Red Scare, and we're going to get our friend McCarthy. So the most famous of the Red Scare's proponents was Joseph McCarthy. As a senator from Wisconsin, he would stir up anti-communist feelings and engage in a hunt for communist spies in the government. And it gets ridiculous. And basically McCarthy does this because he's trying to further his own political career. And that's him right there. He's a crusading senator determined to identify any communist serving in the federal government. He kept claiming he had a list. Most of what he said, not super accurate, just kind of a whole ridiculous time period. But many people were tried. It became a big stigma. People were afraid. It was not good. All right. If it's the international conditions that set the stage for a Cold War, the actions of political leaders and thinkers set the events in motion. So that's our assessment of the Cold War. And we're going to get more into it because the Cold War lasts until 1991. So this is just the beginnings of it. So I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening. And I will see or speak to you soon. Bye.